Good morning. I hope you appreciate the hair ornament. It's not just because of lockdown hair, it's because this morning I'm going to be talking about Esther in the second of our talks on people in the Bible who've been living in difficult circumstances. So I thought I'd better find myself a crown. This is the best I can do. Sorry. Now, the Book of Esther. You may or may not be familiar with it. If you have never read it and you like Game of Thrones, you will love it. If you don't like Game of Thrones, you better read quickly through the violent bits. It's a brilliant book. It's very, very unusual. And I do recommend, just as Tim did, that you read the whole book. It's only 11 chapters or so. I'm going to concentrate, obviously, on only a small part of it this morning, but it's a really, really good story. It's unusual, the Book of Esther, in lots of ways, partly because one of the only books in the Bible that doesn't explicitly mention God. God's definitely there, but he's working behind the scenes. And actually, that's probably true for most of us. We often don't see God's hand until events are finished, or we can look back on things that will have happened to us. So you're going to find that in the Book of Esther, that God is definitely there, but he's working quietly behind the scenes. It's also, don't get bogged down in the fact, this isn't a history book. As Tim said last week, the Bible is made up of lots of different kinds of writings. There's poetry, there are parables, and this is a story meant to explain very much how God works and how God cares for his people. So don't expect it to be historically entirely accurate, but it's a great story of God at work, and it certainly has things to say to us today. Okay, let's go. Well, who's Esther and where's the story set? Well, we are, in terms of the story, we are about 5th century BC, and we're in Babylon, of all places. Now, Esther's life is not terribly promising, it has to be said. She's a Jewish slave in an alien society. She's an orphan. Not great news. And worst of all, she's a woman. Never goes down well in these kind of societies. But God saw her potential, and God had his eye on her just as he has his eye on each one of us right from the very beginning. And he provided for this Jewish orphaned girl. He provided for her right from the very beginning because she was adopted by a very wise Jewish guy called Mordecai. The other thing that's really interesting about Esther, right from the very beginning, in the Bible, in the story, it says in chapter 2, verse 7, she is lovely in form and features. Now, that's not very common in the Bible, that people get these kinds of descriptions. And we might well say, well, so what? God doesn't care what we look like. He's not interested in that sort of thing. But her looks were her gift. And she was going to need that gift to do what God had given her to do. So yes, it's absolutely true, God doesn't care what we look like. But in this particular case, Esther needed those looks to get on with the job that God had provided for her. Now, as a Jewish slave, she probably assumed a fairly ordinary kind of a life. But she's in an extraordinary place. Perhaps we feel we're in an extraordinary place at the minute. But Esther was in a truly extraordinary place. The king of Babylon was a very unpleasant bloke called Xerxes or Ahasuerus, and he was on the lookout for a new queen. He'd got rid of the old one. She'd upset him. It happened quite regularly, I think. So he was on the lookout for a new queen. And Esther, lovely of form and features, finds herself in his harem. Now, this would not have been the ideal choice for a good Jewish girl. She must have wondered, what on earth is God playing at? What am I doing in a Babylonian harem? How do you expect me to live out my Jewish faith in a Babylonian harem, in a country where Jews are despised and hated. But that was all part of God's plan. That's where he put her. And actually, it was the place to be. Her looks got her a place in the harem, but her character got her the job of queen, because she very quickly became the king's favourite and indeed was the queen. God is great at the unexpected, don't you think? The surprising. Just when you think, well, I don't know what's going on here, up pops the most extraordinary thing. And there is always the big picture. Irritatingly, we often don't see the big picture or how we fit into it. But God sees and God knows. In Galatians chapter 1 verse 15, Paul writes, "But God, who set me apart from birth, called me by his grace." Set me apart from birth. Esther, though she didn't know it, not at this point, had been set apart from her birth by God. He did that for Esther. He does the same for us. And as Esther became queen to a difficult, arrogant, self-centered, you name it, Xerxes was it, she grew in character. She listened to Mordecai's advice. She saw what was going on in the court, and she learned how to be a woman of courage and grace and wisdom. Well, she was waiting for what God was doing, I expect. I have no doubt that at this point, Esther would wake up each morning and be saying to God, "What am I doing here?" And how often have we found ourselves in those circumstances? Why am I here? What am I doing? What's the point of this? You might be feeling that right now, actually, in the middle of this pandemic. But God's always on the move, you know. God's always on the move. And we have to be in step with him. That's the important thing. And while Esther is in the harem, while Esther becomes queen, she is learning how to be a truly gracious woman. Now, of course, there is a twist in the circumstances. Because in the story, there is an evil advisor. Well, evil kings always have evil advisors, don't they? And this one called Haman is particularly unpleasant. And he has a thing about the Jews, particularly Mordecai, actually. Mordecai, who has faithfully been going to see Queen Esther, has faithfully been advising her. He really dislikes Mordecai. And because Xerxes is weak and arrogant and rather foolish, in chapter 3, verse 13, Haman persuades the king to set out an edict, a decree, if you will, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the Jews. You can't put it plainer than that, can you? Destroy, kill, and annihilate the Jews. Now, imagine Esther's terror. She is the queen of Babylon, and she's a secret Jew. I don't suppose Esther was thinking at that moment in time, "Hooray, here is my moment to shine for God." I should imagine she was probably absolutely petrified. Because once an edict is sent out by the king, that's pretty much it. And if anybody knew what her faith was, she would probably have been first on the list, and Xerxes would have had a great time making a real example of her. However, her wise friend, her protector, her guide, has something to say to her, to speak into this situation. And he says to Esther in chapter 4, verse 14, "And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this." Wow. Now, that would have been a bit of a facer for Esther. Here's Mordecai having a light bulb moment. Ka-ching! You're the queen. You can do something to save the Jews. Who knows? But you have come for such a time as this. Now, whether we know it or not at the time, whether we feel it emotionally, God gives all of us opportunities to serve in the kingdom. But we have to be prepared to take them. Now, I have a nasty feeling that if I'd have been Esther, I would have been going, oh, really? Are you sure, God? Is this definitely the plan? Is this why I'm here? You know what kind of a man Xerxes is. You know how well this is not going to go down if I go to him and ask these questions. She must have been scared. Now Mordecai says to her, you're the queen. Go to the king. Talk to him. Get him to change his mind. Now Esther's reaction, understandably, was real, probable terror. She's actually also worried that her influence over the king is waning. She says very clearly, I have not been with the king for a month. She's obviously concerned that he's, in true Henry VIII fashion, moved on to somebody else. And actually, no one is allowed to go and just pop in to see the king, not even the queen. You are summoned to see the king. You don't ask to go and speak to him. Well, that's a tall order from Mordecai, a really tall order. And Esther could have said, no, I'm not doing this. I'm going to keep my head down. I'm not doing it. I think a lot of us might have been tempted to say that. You're wrong, Mordecai. This isn't my job. This isn't what I signed up for. What does she do? Very clearly a woman of God. And she asks the other Jews in the city to fast and pray for her for 3 days. She wants to get this right. She wants to be sure that she's doing the right thing. She wants to be sure that people are praying for her. Now, there have been times in my life, certainly, when I have not felt able to pray for myself, when I have been in situations where things have not been great, and I have been very, very aware of people praying for me. When things get tough, get your brothers and sisters to pray for you. When you can't pray for yourself, ask somebody else to pray for you. Because there will be times when you'll be doing that for other people too. When things are really scary, really tricky, get heaven involved. And that's what she did. Mordecai goes back, informs the Jews this is the queen's request, and the prayers go up, the fasting is done. And Esther says, these are her words, these are the words of a queen. In chapter 4, verse 16, she says, when this is done, when the praying and the fasting is over, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Now that is no slave girl speaking. That's a woman who knows God, who suddenly realises this is what her whole life up to this point has been about. This is the point that God has brought her to. She might be shaking in her very elaborate gold shoes. She might be absolutely terrified. But she knows this is her job. And it's also true that God would have found another way, I'm sure, of saving his people if Esther had turned this down. If Esther hadn't done this, there would have been another way. There's always another way for God. I'm sure this has happened probably to you all as well. Sometimes God gives you a word perhaps, or something to tell someone else, and you shuffle in your shoes and you swallow and you think, oh, I can't say that. I've done that. And I'm sure that's fine. God passes over and gives that word to somebody else to pass on. It takes courage sometimes to do what God's asking of you, and quite frequently it's not necessarily something that you want to do. But what an example Esther is. If I perish, I perish. Amazing. And the result of this courage, Esther does it. She goes in to see the king, takes her courage in both hands and does it. She reveals the nature of Haman very cleverly. Read the story properly. And the Jews are saved. Now, there's a lot more to it than that. Read the full book. It's great. Mordecai is honoured. Esther takes the full reins of power. And actually, for Jews, Esther is honoured every year at Purim by the current Jews, who, they see her as someone God used to save his people. So centuries later, her name is still remembered, and who she was is really, really honoured. She's a brilliant role model. She really is. And God saw her right from the beginning. God saw her potential. He gave her the gifts she needed. He equipped her. He gave her time to grow as a person. And then he gave her her opportunities. And she took them. Okay, so that's a long time ago. It's a story. It's a story of God's love for people. So what do we learn from the story today? Bit of a cliche. Life can be scary, tough, unpredictable. God knows that. But this is where he's put you, and he's put me. And this is where we are under his rule and part of his kingdom. This is where we are for such a time as this. And God equips his people. God equips his people in pandemics, just as in the good times. God equips his people to be a viable part of his kingdom. And there's always, always the big picture. And if we can't see the big picture, we have to trust that God's got this. Jeremiah 17 verse 7 says, "But blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him." Whose confidence is in him. Now we are living currently in difficult times. But we have to trust that God has got this. That the big picture is still unravelling, and our role in the big picture is still our role in the big picture. And as well as trust, of course, this takes patience. Oh, that big word, patience. God was patient with Esther. He gave her time to grow into the job. And actually we have to be patient now. Philippians 4 verse 11 says, "I have learned," and that's a key word, "I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances." And that's not easy to say. Because we want to turn around and say to God, "Anytime now, God, great. Finish the pandemic. Let's move on. Back to the good old days, eh?" I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. There are countless examples in the Bible of people who have had to live through the most extraordinary circumstances. And sometimes for a very long time indeed. But God still has this. And as Christians, this is what we cling to. This is what we believe. And this is God, perhaps, reminding us, easy in the good times, not so easy when times are difficult. So we have to be patient as well as trusting. And I think above all, we need to keep praying. Fasting too, perhaps. Certainly praying, because prayer changes things. The Jews praying for Esther to have the courage to do what she did changed things. Prayer gave Esther the courage to do it. It gave her the protection, it gave her the vision that this was her moment. Prayer changes things. Xerxes, as a bad king really, needed better advisors. If he'd had a different advisor, this whole story might never have happened. If he'd had Mordecai from the beginning, none of it would have happened. The Jews would have been set free. But he judged badly. Now, it's very, very easy for us to point the finger at leaders and kings and queens and at anybody in a form of leadership. But I urge you this week, when you read the story of Esther and you see how important it is to have good leaders, I ask you to pray for the leaders of this country, leaders in both secular and spiritual contexts, and pray for each other in our separate, difficult circumstances so that we can hold each other up as Esther was held up. God put us in churches, in spiritual communities, to be a support for each other, which will be to his glory. We all have our own Babylons. Your Babylon might be your work. Your Babylon, your alien place, your difficult place, your place where you feel threatened and intimidated, might be your family. Might be the friends around you. We all have Babylons. But we are all where God has put us for such a time as this, and the world looks at us in such a time as this. It's fascinating to see that many more people are accessing sermons, talks online, are contacting spiritual leaders. The hunger is there in difficult times, and people will be looking at us as Christians to see what our responses are, to see how we behave, to see how we reflect God. And if you feel this week, I've done a pretty rubbish job of this. Actually, I think I have this week. It's not been a great week. Now perhaps is the moment to come before God, to ask somebody you trust to pray for you, to keep things going. Because I think that's particularly important. But remember to pray for the people who are making decisions. Please pray for us as elders. You know, we're under the cosh too, and all the other leaders in our church. But I urge you to come before God this week in real humility and in courage, knowing that this is your moment. God bless. Hope to see you all, actually, face to face, very soon, perhaps minus the headdress.